Welcome to our study of the book of Revelation. Revelation has been a personal favorite of mine going back a number of years, really all the way back to my seminary days. Unfortunately, Revelation is a much misunderstood book. Far too often we modern readers, in approaching the book of Revelation, tend to ignore what it probably would have meant or might have meant to the first century believers who first read or heard this message. So what was the first century like? Now, the first century was the era of the Pax Romana. That means the peace of Rome. In this era, Rome had no serious external threats. There were no external enemies that were capable of threatening the might and the rule of Rome. But even in the first century, Rome was subject to internal unrest, civil war. The Romans were a serious people. They were Stoics. The ideal Roman was a soldier or a statesman, a builder, an engineer. They produced good histories. In fact, Julius Caesar, the great ruler, is also well regarded as an ancient historian. They weren't particularly enamored of music and of plays. Classical Roman society valued austerity, bravery, seriousness, virtue. So let's take a brief survey of ancient Rome. Rome during the first century was actually a very new empire. After hundreds of years of governance as a republic, Julius Caesar came to power in the middle of the first century before Christ and attempted to install himself as an emperor and recreate Rome as an empire. It is from his last name Caesar that we get terms like Tsar in Russian or Kaiser in German. And Julius Caesar himself was assassinated in 44 BC. You may recall from William Shakespeare, "Beware the Ides of March." He was assassinated by the Senator Brutus, the Ides of March, in 44 BC. After Caesar's death, there was a struggle for power. And his adoptive son and nephew, Octavius, won out over several rivals and reigned as an emperor. He took the name Augustus. And Augustus Caesar reigned from 27 BC to 14 AD. And he is often regarded as being the first true emperor. Upon his death, the Romans deified Augustus, meaning that they built altars and shrines and temples to the worship of this god emperor. And this set a precedent. Succeeding emperors after Augustus were all deified upon their death. I don't need to go through all of the emperors of the first century, but I would like to touch on just a few of them. The next one that I will mention is Gaius. He is also known to history as Caligula, Caligula being a nickname that means little boot. He came to power in the year 37 AD. Now Gaius, or Caligula, liked to refer to himself as Jupiter, Jupiter being the Roman name for the king of the pantheon. The Greco-Roman pantheon had a king of the gods. In the Greek, this person is known as Zeus. In Latin or in the Roman pantheon, he's referred to as Jupiter, but he liked to envision himself as being Jupiter or Zeus. After just a few months of rule, he became very harsh, very dictatorial. He killed on a whim, committed multiple affairs with the wives of his chief lieutenants, committed incest with his sisters, and according to one legend, intended, before his death, to install his favorite horse as a high-ranking government official. In the year 40, he actually hatched a plan to erect a statue of himself in the temple in Jerusalem. One can just imagine how well that would have gone over amongst the Jewish populace of Jerusalem. The Roman puppet king of Judea, Herod Agrippa, talked Gaius out of this. Gaius, wisely for himself, listened to Herod Agrippa and did not attempt to install this statue of himself. Ultimately, he would be assassinated. The most important of the emperors for Christians and probably for Jews alike in the first century was Nero. He reigned from 54 to 68 AD. The first several years of Nero's reign were relatively stable, but as the years went by in his reign, Nero became more and more unstable. Nero had always had a flair for the artistic, flair for the dramatic, and this strained Roman sensibilities, if you will. He liked to put on great concerts and plays in the amphitheaters with himself as the leading role, whether it's on stage acting out a part or on a stage singing or playing a musical instrument. Of course, when he did this, he did it to raucous applause from those who were in attendance, who would dare not applaud an emperor who was performing. But this strained Roman sensibilities. A severe fire broke out in Rome in 64 AD. This destroyed much of Rome. Now, it is almost certain that Nero did not start the fire, though that is sometimes mentioned, at least as a legend. It is also quite almost certain that he did not fiddle, as they say, while Rome burned. What is important is that Nero scapegoated the early Christians in Rome. He blamed them for the fire. They're not responsible for it, but he blamed them for it. And he instituted the first serious persecution of Christians in and around Rome itself. And it was during his reign that the apostles Peter and Paul were martyred. Nero is said to have lit his gardens at night by burning Christians at the stake. It is little wonder that Nero was regarded as being essentially evil personified. He was truly evil, or so thought the earliest Christians. And it was during his reign that the Christians began to be viewed as somewhat distinct from Judaism. To give you an idea of Nero's personality, I'll tell you an example. Nero built a platform, a rotating platform under a rotunda. On this rotating platform, he had a throne, and the inside of that rotunda was painted black with the stars and the constellations that were visible to the naked eye. So when Nero sat on his throne on that rotating platform, the effect was that the universe revolved around Nero. Ultimately, Nero was forced to commit suicide in 68 AD. By the middle of 68 AD, he had lost support of the Senate. Some Roman armies had risen in open revolt against him, and he committed suicide. He is replaced by Galba, one of the senators And in early 69, he was assassinated and replaced by Otho, who reigned only for a matter of weeks before he was replaced by Vitellius, and then ultimately in the fall of 69 by Vespasian. 69 AD is well known as the year of the four emperors, Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and ultimately late in the year of Vespasian. Those first three rulers of that year, only each one reigning for a matter of weeks or months at most before either committing suicide or being assassinated. Vespasian had been at the head of the Roman armies in Judea. And in 69, hearing of the unrest back at home in Rome, Vespasian returned, and he left the conquest of Jerusalem and the putting down of the Jewish revolt to his son Titus. Ultimately, it would be Titus and his armies that would destroy Jerusalem. It was ultimately Titus and his armies that crushed the final Jewish resistance at Masada. Vespasian, to return to him, became emperor in late 69 AD, and he had reigned for another 10 years. And he was succeeded by his son Titus, who reigned for only a couple of years. Titus, though he reigned for only just 2 years, was actually well regarded as a ruler. He was relatively generous and fair as a ruler, and unfortunately for him, he died of disease and was succeeded by his younger brother Domitian. Domitian succeeded to the throne in 81, and he'd reigned for some 15 years, and it is widely thought that Domitian was the emperor at the time Revelation was written. Domitian was, in a sense, a good emperor. He was an able administrator, though he did tend at times to micromanage. During his reign, the state and the economy worked well. But Domitian also demanded to be worshipped as a god while he was still alive, and this was a significant break with precedent. As you will recall, previous emperors were always deified upon their death. Domitian demanded to be referred to as a god while he was alive. In fact, he liked to be referred to as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. And so it's during his reign that you had the beginning of emperor worship. Emperor worship of a living emperor. Domitian did begin another round of persecution of the church, but this was not certainly an empire-wide persecution. It was centered in and around Rome. But even though the persecution was centered in and around Rome, there would have been great pressure in other parts of the empire to worship this living God, if you will. Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, home to the 7 cities of Revelation, that region was a hotbed, if you will, of emperor worship. And it was there, in these cities of Asia Minor, that the earliest Christians would have been under great pressure societally to worship the emperors, to worship the gods and goddesses of their pantheon. So that is the landscape of ancient Rome, the landscape in which the first believers lived and practiced their faith. This is the landscape in which they lived and they worshiped. I hope you enjoy your discussion.